Wow, we could just go home. That was great. Thank you. I want to ask you to hold on to this thought as we delve into the message this morning. I'm going to ask if we could put that up on the video or the slides coming. We'll use it as a prayer. It's a poem. It's in your bulletin. Oh, you have it, but I don't. Okay. Let's say it together. Let it go. Let it out. Let it all unravel. Let it free, and it can be a path on which to travel. Amen. That one has gotten me through some difficult times. Okay, I confess, my favorite movie is The Wizard of Oz, so you've probably heard me talk about it before. You're going to hear me talk about it again. I want you to remember the scene from The Wizard of Oz. Just after Dorothy has left Munchkin Land, she is happily skipping off to the Emerald City to meet the wizard, and she comes to a crossroads. And there's where we find out the yellow brick road is not one straight, clear path. She's got some choices to make. And we're all as surprised as Dorothy is. This can't be good. Which way? But it's an unmarked crossroads. Dorothy and the Scarecrow. The Scarecrow's been there for ages, but he's no help. If he only had a brain, well, maybe, but he doesn't. So one road looks as good to him as the other road, and from his vantage point, so they finally just randomly pick one. And off they go, arm in arm, singing merrily. And of course, we all know they do make it to the Emerald City. All's well that ends well, right? But here's the question I have. Maybe you don't think like this, but I do. Have you ever wondered, what's down those other roads? Well, remember the poem by Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken? We sometimes call it The Road Less Traveled, but that's a book based on it. The actual poem is The Road Not Taken. You ever wonder why that poem has lasted over time? I think it's because it hits a nerve with all of us. We all have questions. We all wonder, what might life have been like if I'd just taken that other path? Those roads not taken, those are symbols of regrets. They're second-guessing ourselves. Sometimes they hold possibilities we thought maybe we could have taken. So I thought today we'd just take a look at the idea of roads metaphorically in our lives, the paths we have taken, the wrong turns maybe that we have made, the crossroads of decisions. Where do those roads take us? We're going to talk about roads that we find ourselves on. Thank you, Lori. Roads not taken. Roads that promise to deliver us to a certain destination. Roads that lead us way off the path. And the question is, how do you know when you're on the right road? I know there's been a lot of times in my life when I felt like I was way off the path. Took a wrong turn somewhere, you know. The times when you've made some bad decisions, you've made some bad choices, and now you're left stuck living with the consequences. Or maybe things that just happened to you, not really your fault, but it derailed you, and you just found yourself on the wrong path and can't seem to find the way back to the right one. Do you know that feeling? Well, here's my question. Is there really such a thing as the wrong road? Is there? I'm not advocating reckless living and bad choices, okay? So don't go quoting me that there are no bad roads. Well, okay. But metaphorically speaking, is there such a thing as a wrong road? Is there really a road where we can be truly lost, where there's no hope, where the road cannot lead us back to what is good, back to God? Well, I want to do a demonstration for you. Way back when I was in seminary, I had a theology professor whom I loved. He was a funny old man. Now, actually, when I wrote that down and I thought about it, I thought, I bet he wasn't any older than me. And I thought he was just the most elderly, cute little wise man. Anyway, All changes with your perspective, doesn't it? Anyway, he was very brilliant and very wise, and we were in this small seminar class with him, and we were sitting around a table, and we were delving into the meaning of life and God's purposes and God's plan, and all of a sudden he jumped up out of his seat, and he ran to the head of the table, and he said, okay, here's what we're going to do. You're all looking at me, right? And we were all facing him. He said, I'm going to be God, and you're going to be you. Now, you're looking at me, and here's what God is doing. He's luring. God is luring, calling, come to me. Come to me. Here's the path. It's a path of wholeness. It's a path of healing. It's a path of goodness. Come. Now, it's your task to fully turn toward God. So he said, I want you to do that. I want you to turn your chairs physically and face me. So we did. Okay. Now let's say you, being people with free will, decide that you don't want to come this way. You have your own way, so you turn away from me. And he made us turn our chairs in the opposite direction. So imagine, he's staying where he is, and we turn our chairs, and our backs are now to him. He said, now, in most of our understandings of God, we would say that at this point, God does one of a couple of things. So maybe God stands there and says, all right, you disobedient bunch of you-know-what, and he zaps us. Maybe that's an option, I don't know. Or maybe God just yells at us, hey, 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 what are you doing? Turn around, come back. Or maybe God doesn't do that. Maybe God stands there and says, well, I am the Lord, and you are going in the wrong direction, so I, being the Lord, will be patient, and I will simply wait for you and hope that you will turn back to the God who loves you. That's traditional theologies for the most part. He said, but you know what? Maybe there's another option. What if? And here's the part that just blew me away. He physically ran to the other side of the room where we were looking and stood in front of us this way and said, now, God repositions God's self. What if God moves in response to us, he said. And as God, that's what he was doing. And so now on the other side of the room, he did the same thing. Come. Come to me. Here's the path to healing and wholeness and goodness and reconciliation. Now he said, you as people, you can turn all you want, but God is able and God is willing, because that's how much God loves us. God will pursue us. The hound of heaven will not give up on us. God is not unmovable. God moves in response to the world and in response to us. Now, just so we're clear on this, do the purposes of God change? Does the nature or the character of God change? But God's way of acting changes in response to need. The purpose of God does not change. The character of God does not change. But God's way of acting changes in response to the Holy One and to the needs of grace. I want you to go back to the story that Serene just read from Genesis. I chose that story because it's one of my favorites. It's about Abraham and Sarah. Fine people of faith. Well, no, not really. They do some really stupid, bad things. They take major wrong turns. They get off the road so many times. They simply weren't saints. And our time does not allow us to read the whole story, so you might have to trust me or go ahead and go back and read the whole book of Genesis for yourself. Thank you, Serene. It was a long passage as it was, but that was way condensed, okay? But suffice it to say that Abraham and Sarah had this special calling from God to be the patriarch and the matriarch of a great nation. And they are supposed to be a nation that will be a blessing to all the other nations of the earth. That is the covenant. It's a big deal. They would have a child, God said, a son, and that son would be the father of what we now call Judaism, the people of God. Its purpose was to be a blessing. Now, in that short time, I just covered 6 chapters. So, now here's the problem. It's just one little short verse, and it comes right at the beginning of the story, and it's kind of hidden in all these who begot who, begot who, begot who, but it's in there. It's kind of hidden, but here's all it says. Now, Sarah was barren. You see the problem? The whole promise is based on what? An offspring. And there it says right at the beginning of the story, Sarah was barren. Not childless, as in not yet, but barren as in not ever. That's a problem. That's a problem right off the bat. At this point in the story, Sarah is old and already past the age of childbearing. The hot flashes have come and gone, and she's not going to have children. Okay? That's what it says in Hebrew. I don't even read Hebrew. But anyway. Okay, at desperate times, call for desperate measures. So being desperate, being clever, being smart as they were, and feeling rather creative, Abraham and Sarah came up with their own alternative plan. Another road, so to speak. Isn't that nice that they could be smarter than God? But Sarah had a young, healthy slave named Hagar. Now, Serena already read how they got hold of Hagar. It's because, remember, Pharaoh wanted to take Sarah and put her in the harem, and so Abraham, right after the covenant, Abraham goes, oh yeah, take her, she's my sister. Well, the plagues come, and Pharaoh gets nervous. He thinks he's offended somebody's God, so he sends Sarah back, and he gives, with all these gifts, Hagar is one of those gifts. The Talmud says that she was one of the princesses of Pharaoh's palace. But anyway, we're off the subject. But anyway, Sarah has now this slave who was not supposed to be there in the first place. They picked her up as a result of that bad fork in the road, a fork that they picked up fully knowing that it was not the right thing to do. But suffices to say, Hagar wasn't supposed to be part of the story. They made a bad decision, and there she was. So Sarah gets the bright idea, why don't you have a baby with Hagar? Because she's my slave, in that time and in that culture, it wasn't unusual to do this. And because she was her slave, any child born of that slave was going to be her property. So it would be the offspring of Abram. It would be legally theirs. Morally, in that day and time, it was okay. And my goodness, it was practical. So why not? Let Hagar bear the child of promise. So that's what they decided to do. It's a good plan. And Sarah and Abraham skipped off down that yellow brick road. And what did they find? It was a wrong turn. That road turned rocky and steep very quickly. As soon as Hagar became pregnant, what did Sarah do? She regretted the whole thing. She hated her. She became jealous and resentful. Abraham, she announced one morning over breakfast, we have a problem and it's your fault. Abraham said, dear, you do with her whatever you think is right. He's no dummy. And Sarah treated her terribly, very harshly, so badly that Hagar fled into the desert. That's how bad it was. She was willing to risk her own life and the life of her unborn child to get away from the cruelties she was experiencing from these so-called saints of our faith. Now, this mistake is theirs. Hagar is now out in the desert about to die with her unborn child. That's another mistake. And God changes the plot. That's remarkable. God responds to Hagar's suffering. She's not supposed to be there in the first place. She's given water to drink. She's promised that her child would make her the mother of a great nation of her own. And then she was told to go back to Sarah and Abraham. Now just stop here for a minute. This is remarkable. God has just made a major commitment to someone who was never supposed to be a part of the story. That is remarkable. Abraham and Sarah had gone down the wrong road not once but twice, and God responded, didn't demand what should have been and the heck with the results. God responded to what was, and God was gracious. So Hagar goes back, and Abram now has his son Ishmael, a legal firstborn son, but God says, oh no, I brought her back, but I'll be sure Hagar and Ishmael are taken care of. But that promise, that I made to you, that hasn't changed. My purposes have not changed, just my actions. So old Sarah did conceive and give birth to her own son, and they named him Isaac. Anybody know what it means? Maybe laughter. Because they were laughing. They were happy, and the promise was fulfilled. All was made right with the world. Smooth roads ahead. No. There they are at breakfast again. Abraham, we have a problem, and it's your fault. What? Get rid of that slave woman and her child, because I'm not going to have the son of that slave woman share the inheritance with my son Isaac. Now, I want you to take note here. Nobody in this story calls Hagar by her name except God. Nobody else will show her that respect. She's always that slave woman. So here we are again. Hagar finds herself back in the desert. This time it's not her choice. She was banished. And this time she has a child. And God heard their crying. So God called out to Hagar a second time, and God provided her and Ishmael with fresh water, and they lived, and from Ishmael, Hagar did become the mother of a great nation. It's the nation we call Islam. See what that mistake has dealt us all these years later? Does this story bother you? Because it bothers me. I mean, we're talking about Abraham and Sarah, patriarchs and matriarchs of our faith, the wonderful people, but they make some really stupid, reckless choices and suffer the consequences. But here's what really bothers me. They are willing to be cruel, very cruel, even to the point of manslaughter, to try to fix the problems they created. That bothers me. But it is kind of remarkable, I think, that this story even exists in our Bible. I mean, you would think, as going through the canonization process, wouldn't you want to clean it up a little and make your patriarch and your matriarch look a little bit more noble? Not quite so stupid? I wonder why they did that, or didn't do that. Because no one in this story comes off looking good, except one. It's not Abraham, because he's weak and gullible and willing to be cruel. It's not Sarah. She's looking out for her own, and she's willing to do what it takes to protect what she has and who she loves, even if it means death for another woman and her child. Well, it's not even Hagar. She's not so much bad as that she's a slave. She has no voice. The only one who is good in this story is God. God. God was good even when it meant that God had to do some really clever rearranging after some of the antics Abraham and Sarah pulled off. Are we surprised? I mean, isn't this the same God who banished Adam and Eve from the Garden of Perfection and then went with them? Why didn't God just stay? Good riddance. But the purposes of God don't change. The character of God doesn't change. But the way of acting, the way God acts changes in response to our needs. God made room for Hagar, even though she was a mistake. God created a path in response to all the mistakes and wrong choices that Abraham and Sarah made. You know, sometimes I think we get the idea that God is unbending and legalistic, that once God makes a proclamation, that's all there is to it, and heaven forbid that we should ever mess things up, because that would just mean eternal damnation, get rid of them. Well, something like that. How many of you were raised that way? Don't raise your hand. That's not what this story says. I like to call it gracious creativity. That God could take Abraham and Sarah's mistake and find a way to include it in the overarching loving plans of God. Graciously creative. Maybe this story exists, warts and all, because it isn't about Abraham and Sarah, or even Hagar and Ishmael at all. Maybe this story exists with all its ugliness because ultimately it is not a story about the frailties and stupidities of people, but that it is a story about the gracious creativity of God. God did not so much bless the mistakes and bad choices of these people, but God was able and willing to rearrange the promise so that it could embrace and transform those mistakes and bad choices. And I think God can do the same things in our lives. Back to the Wizard of Oz. You know what I find amazing is that Dorothy found that Emerald City at all, seeing as how she had so many options along the way, and why didn't she take a wrong turn? How did she end up on the right path? She found that Emerald City, and in the end, all of them that go with her find their heart's desire, a mind, a heart, courage, a home. Is it because they did just luck out and actually pick the right road at every turn? Or is that the only way you and I can find home? God? Stay on the right road, never veer off? Well, here's the truth. We really don't know that Dorothy always chose correctly. Maybe those other roads would have taken her directly and more easily to Oz. Maybe she wouldn't have even had to see those evil apple trees or that scary dark forest or, heaven forbid, those awful wicked witches and flying monkeys. Maybe those other roads would have been better. But maybe there is no one right road except the one we're on. And maybe the way to God or the way back home, as it was for Dorothy, maybe the right road has been there with us all along, right beneath our feet. Probably not covered in ruby-colored sequins, but it was with us all the time. God present, laying out a path before us, brick by brick, in response to our choices. But that path always leads to goodness and wholeness and healing. God laying out before us as we go, brick by brick, a path toward wholeness and goodness and love. What we have in the story of Abraham and Sarah is not the story of the unwavering faithfulness of a chosen man and a chosen woman, but the story of the unwavering faithfulness of God, who is willing to adapt and change in order, not the purposes, not the character, but to act in response and be graciously creative. God who is always for us, God who journeys with us wherever we find ourselves, God who remains faithful to us because we are loved that much, because it is in God's nature to be gracious always. And God is always graciously creating new life, new hope, new joy on whatever road you find yourself.